So, Preston, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about for a while now is that you believe that A Song of Ice and Fire has a bit of sci-fi in it, or a lot of it has sci-fi in it, right?
Well, I mean, like I often put forward that there is no magic. There's just telepathy, telekinesis, and technology. And I mean, that's not the full story of what I believe, but it's a useful way to examine the narrative, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because people get super emotional about like when I say, well, maybe it's science fiction, and like in the past there was this advanced futuristic society, and then there's nuclear war, and now we're left with this medieval society, which would fit with like everything else that George R. R. Martin's written. But it really gets people. It gets a lot of people angry.
That is something I've known. People have taken to calling you a liar because apparently George has said that no, it's a fantasy with magic, and you're saying otherwise. But let me ask you this though: is there a major difference between psychic abilities and magic?
No, and that's the whole premise. So I mean, you've got to go with so the guy that wrote 2001, Arthur C. Clarke. He came up with something, they called the Clarke's Law, that if you don't have an explanation for something, like, then it appears to be magic. Like technology, if one doesn't understand technology, it seems like magic. So there was the discussion of like, what are the monoliths in 2001? Don't they seem like magic? But it's a sci-fi story, even though there's no explanation on how these monoliths work, or how they transform Jupiter into a star, or any of that. We kind of accept that it's future technology from this other race, and it's a sci-fi story, so we accept it's sci-fi. And for some reason, like when we talk about Ice and Fire, everyone's like, oh no, that's all magic. And you're like, well, what's the difference? Like, and I personally believe there is a difference between magic and science fiction. But I'll tell you, George R. R. Martin doesn't believe there's a difference between magic and science fiction.
Well, before we get into that, I neglected to do a proper intro to this video. This is a topic I've been wanting to discuss with you for a while now. We've discussed it before briefly, but never in depth. And this is also something that gets brought up a lot, your belief that it's a sci-fi story more so than a fantasy, and it's mainly brought to me by other YouTubers and even viewers as well, and the reaction is always,
Yeah.
Carmine, did you know that Preston believes this? Isn't he crazy? And I'm not even mentioning the more harsher critics on forums, Facebook groups, and subreddits, but yeah, like you said so yourself, people are really passionate about keeping the story as a fantasy. And I will say, personally, I am kind of one of those people. I'd like it to just be a fantasy, but I'm also open-minded about having, about it having sci-fi elements in it. That's just my personal preference. But, like, what's your take on people just being so up in arms against your idea on this topic? Because they really are.
I think it has to do with how people connect to the story. I think people want to feel like they're a knight. And so when they project themselves into the story, say they connect with Jon Snow, and Jon Snow is this sword wielding, brother of the Night's Watch of the Wall, fighting this mystical army. That seems cooler to them than nerdy sci-fi, which is funny because fantasy is just as nerdy as science fiction. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, I don't know. I think people when they project their own personality, when they project themselves in it, they want to be Conan the Barbarian or something.
Full all muscled and sword wielding and
like extra butch or something. While they don't want to be Spock. But it because and that's how they separate these things out. But they're like, here's the thing is there is George R. R. Martin doesn't believe there's a difference. I would say I personally believe there's a difference in the sense that I think science fiction has rules and I think that I think that magic does not have rules. And this is a big differentiation why I think it's important to look at Ice and Fire through a science fiction lens. George R.R. Martin doesn't make those differentiations. Like, he thinks fantasy and sci-fi are the same thing. So when people say like, oh, George R.R. Martin said it's magic, that's a disingenuous like argument because he believes they're the same thing. So
well, there is a quote by him here. It's
Yeah.
from an interview with January Magazine in January 2001. I'll leave a link. Well, it's on your channel, so you leave a link in the description below. But
Sure.
this is what he said. It's definitely a fantasy novel. It has dragons and so forth in it. It does have the feel of historical fiction, and I love history. I wanted to get a lot of sense of history in A Storm of Swords and the other books, and some of that feel historical fiction, so on and so forth. The takeaway from this is that, like he says, it's a fantasy novel, not a sci-fi. It has dragons and so forth. I'm assuming so forth means the magic. And there's also a clip here that I'm going to play where he says,
I knew it wasn't part of the science fiction novel I was writing. This was clearly a fantasy, medieval, had these wolves and this large family. I'd been reading a lot of historical fiction, and it might have been in the back of my mind, but suddenly it all gelled, and I wrote that chapter in like 2-3 days. It just came to pour out of me.
Now, there are numerous other clips exactly like that one where he basically just says the same thing he said there. So, Preston, I bring this to you. How do you counter what the big man himself has said?
because George R. R. Martin, like, I can like outquote you if you want. Like, I have here, if you go to Dream Songs, he has an entire essay on something called the furniture rules. And he says, we can make up all the definitions of science fiction and fantasy and horror that we want. We can draw our boundaries and make our labels, but in the end, it's still the same old story. The one about the human heart in conflict with itself. The rest, my friends, is furniture. The house of fantasy is built of stone and wood and furnished in high medieval. Its people travel by horse and galley, fight with sword and spell and battle axe, communicate by palantir or raven, or break bread with elves and dragons. The house of science fiction is built on duralloy and plastic and furnished in faux furniture. Its people travel by starship and air car, fight with nukes and tailored germs, communicate by ensemble and laser, and break protein bars with aliens. The furniture rules, I call it. Forget the definitions, furniture rules. And then he goes on to talk about Phyllis Eisenstein, who wrote an entire story in that appears to be medieval, but in fact is science fiction because it involves, teleportation, and that's about it. And then he goes on and talks about this other writer, John Williams, who wrote this book called Metropolitan, in which they live in this futuristic city, but they have everything's metered by like this plasm authority, and everyone has this plasm, which is just a frickin' stand-in for ether or magic or mana or whatever, because everybody else uses like magic in this story. So he'll talk about how like fantasy and science fiction are one and the same, and we use the terms when they don't even make sense. Like, he even puts forward time travel. Whenever we have a time travel story, we put that in science fiction. But he says, what's more fantastical than time travel? Time travel makes no sense in any sort of like science-y way. And yet when we do time travel, which is completely fantastical, that's for some reason science fiction. Like, none of these things really make sense. And so when he goes around talking about like, oh, it's fantasy and not science fiction. Well, the problem is that in a completely different essay, he talks about how science fiction and fantasy are one and the same. So when people are like, oh, you're calling George R. R. Martin a liar. No, I'm fucking not. He's either contradicting himself or he doesn't believe there's any difference. So when he says it's not science fiction, it's fantasy, like he's just talking about the dressing of it. He's not talking about the essence of it. Like, the essence of everything is the same. That's what he believes. You can read this Furniture Rules essay in Dream Songs. Like, there's anyone who's read this would like cannot deny this. Like, just open up Dream Songs and read this essay. And when he talks about like, oh, well, it's science fiction, it's not science fiction, it's fantasy, it's not fantasy. Like that's just the furniture. It's not the essence. Where he's defining things different from everyone else. So when people say, like, you and I, when we talk about science fiction and fantasy, we have different definitions than he does when he uses those terms. And so that's the big thing.
So essentially what you're saying here is that you probably understand George Martin's meanings more than other people who say it's not a sci-fi.
Right. All you have to do is open Dream Songs. I'm not saying like that this is.
But people
this is
don't
from...
want to do that. You know how people are, especially with this fandom. It's kind of crazy. If you say one thing wrong, people jump on you. I mean, look at your entire history on YouTube.
Well, the point of it all is the reason I put quotes in all of my videos, and the reason I did things like the Thousand Worlds Book Club. It's not like I'm like the Thousand Worlds Book Club. Like that many people watched it. I wasn't doing it for money. Like I spent years like putting out like video after video on the Thousand Worlds Book Club because I just wanted people to read this other stuff because it starts a conversation. Like once you have this basis, like when I go forward, when I have arguments with people or people like, and people are like making these, have these ideas about where the story is going, they're basing it off of Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time and other fantasy stuff. And it's like, well, rather than looking at things through the scope of fantasy and traditional fantasy, why don't you look through the scope of George R. R. Martin's writing? And that's all I want people to do. If you still, after reading his stuff, like come to the same conclusion, great. But I just want for people to have this other view to understand things. So when I say like it's a sci-fi story, what I'm trying to get people to focus on is that George R. R. Martin has rules to his magic. This is not like Harry Potter. You know, when there's that little amulet that allows Harry Potter to go back in time, it's not like there's any logic to how that functions.
It just works and you expect it to believe it works because magic, and there you go.
Right. It's just magic, blah, blah, that's it. Like when George R. R. Martin thinks about these things, he thinks about rules. And so even if we take the most, magic-like fantastical element of the story, which I would say is probably the possibility that there's a shadow baby, right? Like when that shadow baby or whatever happened went and killed Renly, like if you examine it closely, Stannis is asleep. He can't be woken up. It's just like Bran, like when he's warging. And so all of a sudden you're seeing rules to, what's going on. Now, the exact dynamics of everything going on, we're not quite sure, but we see these similar things going on. George R. R. Martin knows what's going on. He purposely made Stannis in bed, unable to wake up, as if he's warging, as if he's skin changing. He purposely did that to parallel Bran because he has rules in his mind. And that's how you and I define, and I'm putting that on you.
No, go for it.
I mean, do you agree that like science fiction tends to have more rules than fantasy?
I do kind of agree with you to an extent, because the magic in Thrones, and I've said this before, seems to be more grounded. One good example is the shadow assassin that Melisandre spawns. Instead of a normal high fantasy series where you can snap your fingers, recite some words, or open up a scroll and summon some kind of avatar, she had to actually be impregnated and give birth to the thing. It has its own rules. Even if it's not scientific ones that would make sense in a sci-fi setting, or even if it's not complex rules, it's still there, just enough to show the audience that you can't just flick a wand and do whatever you want like in Harry Potter. It has to be more realistic in its approach, or as real as magic could be. I always use the word grounded. It has to be grounded in something, and not just, and it happens.
And that's the thing, is other stories, other fantasy stories don't have that. And so when I say it's important to think about, like I always talk about skin changing and warging and green sight as telepathy. And once you start thinking about it as telepathy, like a lot of things start making sense. Like, when you compare, especially when you compare it to how telepathy works in other George R. R. Martin stories, or even how George R. R. Martin handles time travel. He handles it similar, in other science fiction stories. And so that's what's really important. Of course, like when people are like, well, isn't telepathy and telekinesis magic? Yes, of course it is. But we traditionally define it as science fiction. And that's the point. The point in the end is science fiction and fantasy are the same to George R.R. Martin. So even when I say like, oh, it's a sci-fi story secretly, well, it's because sci-fi and fantasy are the same thing. All these statements don't mean anything because George R.R. Martin thinks they're the same. You can't really say it's a science fiction story, not a fantasy story, because they're the same thing. And you can't say, no, it is a fantasy story, not a science fiction story, because to George R.R. Martin, they're the same thing.
Like I said, once again, I would like it to stay a fantasy. If he's going to throw in, a bit of sci-fi in there, I want it to be like way back, maybe, as a passing thing that happens, because there are elements of it. And in other fantasy stories as well, there is a bit of sci-fi thrown in there. For example, in The Witcher, the reason The Witcher world has magic is because apparently in that universe there was a cataclysm that joined different dimensions and worlds together into one, which explains why there's magic and monsters in it. Another fantasy series is Warhammer Fantasy, which is a spin-off of Warhammer 40k, where in 40k, humanity, as well as other races like orcs and elves, are spacefaring and have huge weapons of mass destruction and so on and so forth. And in fantasy, some people believe that the fantasy world, with knights and all that, is surrounded by like certain black holes that none of the other spacefaring races can get to. Thus why it's fantasy. And don't even get me started on the Final Fantasy series, which is supposed to be fantasy, but it has a lot of sci-fi in it as well. So there are other stories and series that have this as well.
Right. And, I mean, it's also fairly undeniable that George R. R. Martin has included elements that make us think that it might be science fiction. I mean, there's definitely elements that, whether it be The Long Night or what happened at Hardhome, that make you go, oh, that sounds like nuclear winter. That sounds like a nuclear bomb went off. Like, he's included those things, like, intentionally. It's hard to deny that, like, that there aren't, those elements in there. I don't know, or even looking back at Storm's End, and like, if you read a description of Storm's End and you like bring up a picture of a nuclear power plant or the Hoover Dam, or something modern, like a modern structure, and reread that Catelyn chapter where she describes what Storm's End looks like, and it's hard not to think like, oh crap, this is something futuristic, like it's made of concrete, not brick, and it's like, don't take my word for it. Just like go back, pull up the Catelyn chapter, read a description of Storm's End, pull up the Jon chapter, read a description of Hardhome, and tell me that it's like George R. R. Martin is not trying to like put in hints of science fiction. Like I'm almost like, just sometimes I'm just like dumbfounded that like some people don't see that. Like, have they been reading like so much Lord of the Rings and then going into like Ice and Fire that they can't see these other things going on? Just, and like that's the thing. Just pull it up, or pull up Dream Songs and read the Furniture Rules essay. Like, it's like that's what I tell people. Like, you can take one quote from George R. R. Martin and where he's like, oh well, this is magic. Well, yeah, I've been in the room where George R. R. Martin said, like, oh, Ice and Fire, this is a world with real magic.
Wait, you were in a room with George R. R. Martin when he said this?
Yes. Like, I was, I mean, so was 1,000 people, but.
Oh, okay, I was about to say,
yeah, I mean,
you have a private conversation with George R. R. Martin I'm not aware about?
No, I mean, I told you about the one I had, but no, I've
this was at Balticon, yeah?
Yeah. But at Balticon, yeah, I mean, you're in the auditorium, and he literally said, like, this is a world with real magic. He said that. Now, what the hell is real magic? I don't, like, is telepathy and telekinesis real magic, or is that science fiction? Like, if you were describing a story with telekinesis and telepathy, is that real magic or not? And then how can you, and when he says something like that, how do you reconcile it with the furniture rules essay? And like all of these things, like keep in mind, like when he goes into Phyllis Eisenstein's, like, so Phyllis Eisenstein is who he dedicated Ice and Fire to. And Eisenstein, and he purposely, you know, in other interviews, he said like, oh, I was wondering if like if it should be more real and grounded, and Eisenstein like convinced me to put in dragons and make it more fantastical. But the question is like, well, like how far did she convince him to do that? Because it's definitely not Harry Potter in the level of magic. You know, it's definitely not over the top. Like magic is like, and even when he proposed the story, he calls it high fantasy, but really it's not really that high fantasy. Like it's the average person doesn't necessarily believe in magic. Like the magic is rare in our story, you know, and almost all of it can be explained away with science. Like, you know, Aaron bringing people back to life on the beach, you know, that being, you know, CPR and things like that. You know, so, yeah, it's just, I don't know. I mean, I get a little emotional here too, just in the sense that like, how can you like just open it up and read these things? It's right there. Like, I'm not keeping or hoarding anything from people.
Well,
like,
come on. Some people don't have the ability. It's not that they're dumb or anything. Some people don't have the ability to look deeper into things. Otherwise, we'd all be detectives.
Yeah, I mean, it's just also like A Dance with Dragons opens with an entire chapter dedicated to Varamir Sixskins. And I remember the first time I read A Dance with Dragons, and you're like, all right, finally cracking this book open. We're going to get back to the big plots that I care about. You know, Tyrion, Jon, Bran, and then Theon, and then you open it and it's Varamir Sixskins, this like random wildling that you barely remember from you know, Storm of Swords, like just, you know, has a cameo pretty much. And it's this long, really detailed description of the rules of skin changing. And it goes on and on about how skin changing works, and, you know, what is considered an abomination, and what one is allowed to do, and which animals are easy to skin change into and such. And it's like why on earth was all of these rules and details on skin changing told to us? Because actually hardly any of it's used, like, at all, like in the book. Like, yeah, Bran like skin changes some ravens in Hodor, but he did that in A Storm of Swords. Like, but you know, why this whole chapter on the rules of skin changing? Well, George R.R. Martin thinks about that stuff, and he wanted to write it. You know, like there's no way Harry Potter would have like and I've never read Harry Potter, but I'm sorry to people if it sounds like I'm picking on Harry Potter, because I'm not. It's just something different, but it's like...
It's okay, guys. He's shit on the Silmarillion way many more times than Harry Potter. Continue.
Right, but would there be an entire chapter like dedicating like, this is how wands work? You know, I don't know. Like, it doesn't seem like
there is. I don't...
Right.
Maybe, I don't know. I haven't read Harry Potter in ages, but I'm sure someone in the comments section will call us assholes and idiots for not remembering that one secret special chapter.
Or like, think about how angry people were because Star Wars is space fantasy, and like, think about how angry people got when midichlorians were added to the mix.
Well, people got angry at midichlorians because the Force was like this, you know, unexplained, almost mysterious like thing that certain select people have, and here that asshole comes and breaks it down to a science. Like, fuck you, dude. Leave some of the mystery there.
Right. Well, see, there it is. You know, like, it's the same. It's the same thing, right? Like, you know, we have this science fiction kind of thing that everybody perceives as science fantasy or whatever. And George Lucas made it a little more science fiction-y, and everyone's like, oh God, stop, no. Like,
because it ruins it. People like the mystery.
Right. And George R. Martin, like, knows that too. He loves keeping mysteries, you know. But in the back of his head, or perhaps in his head and never to the page, he has every rule thought out. But, you know, he thinks about these things, you know. And he wrote an entire chapter on the rules of skin changing, you know, for some reason. But you know, what if it were magic? I don't know. I don't think that would have been done.
What's still funny to me is the massive hatred for this one idea you have, either because it's like, you know, coming from you or whatever else, but with the themes and situations and topics presented in Ice and Fire that people enjoy, you would assume they would have an open mind about certain things. And I don't know, I guess I find it a little ironic.
Well, I think any change people are resistant to, like, you know, and so when I put out this idea that maybe it's not fantasy, maybe it's science fiction, like, people they're still on their, I think a lot of people are still on Lord of the Rings, and they want more Lord of the Rings, and this was their stand-in, like Ice and Fire was their stand-in. And so when I say, you've been fooled the entire time, you've been secretly eating people or whatever, you've been secretly eating science fiction, people get angry about that, anything new, even if it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like, with The Last Jedi, everyone got really upset about seeing Leia fly through space.
Because it was stupid. Come on.
Well, at the same time, like, I remember watching I watched a Because Science episode. You ever watch that?
Because Science?
Because Science is pretty good. It's pretty good.
I've never seen that.
So this guy will take popular movies and then explain, like, how some of them work or could work scientifically and what wouldn't work and things like that. Like, it's pretty fun. It's pretty funny stuff.
The guy who kind of looks like Thor? I'm looking at him now. Holy shit, looks like Thor. Yeah,
that's him. So he described like Leia flying through space is actually one of the most explainable, logical things consistently within the universe, right?
What, really?
Because if you're able to use the Force to, say, grab a rock, right, and have it fly to you, right? So on every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So if she's using the Force, all she has to do is use the Force on the spaceship, and because there's no friction in space, she would pull herself towards the spaceship by using the Force on it, and it would be effortless. And so, like, Leia flying through space, like, scientifically made the most sense, because it would take such a little amount of force, because they're in space and
that's not how the Force works. What the fuck? I gotta watch this episode. But
it's totally true. Like, once you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, no, that's totally true. It's sort of like if you're in the middle of a pond on ice skates, and if you take, like, your jacket off and you throw it, you will go in the opposite direction of your jacket. And right, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Mm-hmm. So if the Force is implementing a force for every action, that means if you're pulling a glass to you, you're being pulled to the glass as well, right? Because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So for Leia to pull herself towards the ship, she just has to use the most minimal effort to pull the ship towards her, and she'll go flying towards the ship.
I mean, I guess, but, like, the way the Force is kind of explained in, like, novels and stuff like that, or maybe they've scrapped this, the way it used to be, was using the Force, especially a lot, drains a lot of, like, it just drains a lot out of you. That's why a lot of the times when they're using the Force, it's to, like, have smaller objects come towards them. But if they're gonna push and pull and bigger objects, it just takes a lot of strain, and sometimes not everyone can do it.
But she would only need the minimal amount because there's no friction in space.
That's right, yeah. God damn it. It's still stupid. It's still stupid. Whatever. I'm actually, a lot of this stuff actually seems interesting because science, because I can't get over how this guy looks like Thor. I can't get over it. And that's
there's a lot of, I mean, some episodes are obviously better than others, but there's some really funny ones about how like the Death Star would never work ever because like the amount of force that would be shooting out of the Death Star would send the Death Star in the opposite direction at such it's such a high speed that every single person inside would be liquefied. Like it's just like they're like, but it's only shooting a laser, and it's like doesn't matter. Like even the weight of like photons. Like, it's such an amount of immense force to destroy a planet that it would propel the Death Star backwards at such a speed that it was some thousands of G's. Like, it's just incredible. But anyway, we digress. Even when something makes sense, because it's new, people are going to be resistant to it because they're resistant to change.
And I also want to counter on one thing you said. I don't think it's because people want more Lord of the Rings and they're, I guess, using Game of Thrones as a placeholder. I think it's people enjoy Lord of the Rings and they enjoy the fantasy that it is, and they want something else that's like it. I don't think they're looking for Lord of the Rings 2 in Game of Thrones. I just think they, and I kind of agree with this as well. I love The Witcher so much so where I would I probably shouldn't say this, but I love The Witcher so much to the point that if The Witcher had more content to it, I would probably devote my entire channel to The Witcher. I really love that series. And when it ends for me, because I haven't gotten the new book, when it ends for me, I'm gonna feel very empty inside. I'm gonna want something else that's like The Witcher. So I can understand people who want A Song of Ice and Fire to be Lord of the Rings, but with more sex and politics. I get it. They want more of it, and it's just not it. Like I said, my thoughts on this is I would like Thrones to be pure fantasy. If there are some sci-fi elements there, I want them to be maybe mentioned in passing or in the back of your head. And, I mean, you still can't deny that the whole glamour thing, when, I believe it was in the books where Melisandre glamours Mance to look like the Lord of Bones.
Yeah.
That could... You could argue that's magic, but I can also see how that may be like, little
holographic technology,
Mm-hmm. So
because we have no idea how those gems work. I mean, they might be left over from some sort of futuristic society in a Shai or whatever. So
it's funny.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
People call you very snobby because you can come off as a book snob, and I guess me too. Someone lobbied that at me recently. But I understand where you're coming from. Is that the books in the show? It's like eating a great steak and then going to McDonald's. You're just trying to show people that the steak does taste good.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the main thing, was just like, clue people into these things, take a look at it, notice it. Because there's a lot of things that people really obsess and focus on that aren't even that like big in the book. Like so this idea that Jon Snow is some sort of like Jesus Christ figure that's going to save the day, and he's Aragon and he's going to defeat this huge army and fulfill prophecy and all that Harry Potter stuff. There's nothing in the book that actually even suggests that in any sort of explicit sense. I mean, you can read into it if you want, here and there. I mean, but it's like it doesn't have anything to do with the plot. Like, nobody's story right now is dependent upon Jon Snow being special. Like, nothing in the story involves that.
Well, Preston, come on. I mean, you got to give people somebody to be. I mean, you're either Jon Snow or a sister fucker, or a fat guy that nobody really cares about, or a dwarf, or a cripple, or Hodor. I mean, like, who the fuck wants to be those guys?
Well, I mean, yeah, as I said, he's the standard, he's the standard Joe heterosexual male, guy that everyone can be like, that's me. I'm Jon Snow. Yeah. Yeah. And what's funny is even the sister fucker, people like him. Because that's like, he comes in second for who people can relate to.
Yeah, but people want their right hand, so.
They're like, everybody's like, fuck Catelyn. But Jaime, yeah, he's great.
That's probably why they also gave Bronn a much bigger role in the books. Like, I don't remember Bronn being really big in the books. I think he falls off around Feast for Crows and you never see him again.
Yeah, I mean, he does some off-screen stuff in A Feast for Crows. They talk about him, but he doesn't appear. And then that's it. Like, he's last seen in A Storm of Swords, and then he disappears, and he's. By the way,
I recall you saying something along the lines of that's what you like about the television show, that they don't do a lot of magic that much.
No, I really thought that I thought that was that one of the things they did really well is that they scaled it back, and I think that they had to scale it back because in the book. Because the book has a point of view of people in the world, like they're gonna describe something how they've always seen it. They don't think there's anything odd to what they're seeing. Like when Catelyn looks upon Storm's End, she sees a castle. She doesn't sit there and go, "Whoa, this looks like a weird futuristic, structure." Like she describes it like an incredible castle, because that's what she knows. And so there's some leeway, like when people describe things as being magical, well, there's the bias of their point of view that we can take in but with the show, there's not that same bias. Like we're observing from a third person. So we have to accept that stuff is there.
Well, like, all our major magical characters that can use magic, with the exception of Thoros of Myr and Melisandre, are not really in there. I mean, whatchamacall we only get the pirate Pre. Is that his name?
Yeah.
We only get him in season 2. He doesn't come back at all. We kind of get a small assassination attempt in the beginning of season 3 with Dany with him, but then it never shows up ever again. Makuro, am I saying his name right? The guy, what's his name? Victarion meets. Yeah, he's not in it. Benero?
Right. Yeah.
He's also not in it. Quaithe also shows up one time, does nothing magical. Doesn't even use the glass candle.
There were some fire dancers in the book, and the fire dancers aren't there. Like there's pyrokineticists, or people that can like dance with like do flames in the air. That they don't have any of that. Like I'm trying to think, like the most magical thing is the shadow baby, but even in the show they introduce the idea that and they don't even do this in the book, but even in the show they introduce the idea that like with black smoke you can cause somebody to hallucinate. Like Melisandre shows off a potion to Selyse and introduces the idea that the shadow baby was a hallucination, though we literally see something like kill Renly. So
I mean, the only thing that we see that's full on magical, that what we've been describing with the whole fireball flick of a wand, is the Children of the Forest. In season 6, I believe, when the White Walkers are attacking, they
throw those Pokeball grenades.
Someone's been playing too much Pokemon Go.
Yeah. I guess Jon's resurrection and the resurrection of Thoros of Myr. Of shit. I'm blanking on the Brotherhood Without Banners.
You mean Beric?
Beric Dondarrion, yeah.
Well, to be fair, those are very scarce.
Yeah.
Those are very scarce. It doesn't happen like fairly often. I think Beric was revived once on screen, And
Yeah.
Jon was revived once as well, and the Children of the Forest using the whole magic fireball things, that also happened once. So it's very scarce.
Yeah. Yes. It would have been, what's funny is they could have made it a little more ambiguous. I would have actually liked it to be more ambiguous.
How so? Like, how would you change it?
Well, let's say they had Jon stabbed, but they didn't have him stabbed as much. Like, let's say they had one stab. And then you're like, and people are like, oh, is he dead? I don't know if he's dead. And then he like wakes up like slowly, and you're like unsure if he actually was resurrected or if he like survived the stab or if he survived a stabbing. Like, I would have liked that more. Like a stab through the heart where he's like out cold and blue on the table, like that's pretty clear that he was dead and brought back. But I would have liked it better if like he was stabbed and it was a little ambiguous on whether or not he was dead or not,
When that episode happened, there were people freaking out because, Jon Snow.
Yeah.
And there was an article where this one guy interviews a CO, a guard at a prison, and apparently the guard says, well, I've seen people stabbed like 40 times and still survive. So, I mean, you might have something there.
Yeah, but he's a pretty bad stabs. Then again, I mean, frickin' Arya Wolverine, so you never know.
It's funny, we never really think of what the Faceless Men are doing as magic.
Fair enough. In the show, they started doing stuff with masks and stuff, right? So the show makes it a little. I suppose when Jaqen does his first face change, it's really fast, and so it kind of appears to be magic. But later, then they kind of just go with mask after mask after mask, so they kind of removed the magical element to it.
Do you like that better?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, like, again, I like the idea of it being all explained by telepathy, telekinesis, and technology. Like, I like the idea that that they've been fooling people for years or whatever, a decade or so, a decade with the show and longer, much longer with the books. Like, that'd be a great con. It would be a great con for George R.R. Martin to do that, and blow everyone's mind and make them angry or whatever. But
well, Preston, I just this is a video I've been waiting to for a long time. Once again, like, I'll have a lot of people coming to me because, of course, you don't read your shit. I have a lot of people, other content creators, coming to me and saying, "Show this to Preston. George R. R. Martin said it was," and Preston's calling him a liar. So I've been wanting to do this video with you for a while. So
yes. First of all, that I have to tell you a story about the term. Real short, but once I went out to I parked my car in the city in DC, and I knew I had to feed my meter after a certain amount of time, and so I run out to feed my meter, and the meter guy has given me a ticket, and he's only 2 cars ahead, and I run out and I'm like, whoa, like why are you giving me a ticket? Like, there's no way I've been here. And in DC, there weren't actual like meters. There's sometimes signs that say like 2 hours. And I run out and I'm like, there's no way I've been here 2 hours. And the guy is like, you have been here 2 hours. I don't appreciate you calling me a liar. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, just because information like is different and incorrect and off doesn't mean someone is lying. Like, someone can be mistaken. There can be more complexities to it. So like, and this is the thing, like, well, George R. R. Martin said this. So if you contradict it, you're calling him a liar. Like, and this meter guy was clearly escalating it because he wanted to escalate it like that. He wanted to make me personally insulting him. I wasn't insulting him. I was implying he was mistaken, not that he was a liar. And so when somebody like Preston is calling George R. R. Martin a liar, that's fucking disingenuous. Okay? No, I'm not calling anybody a fucking liar, but I'll say this. George R. R. Martin is he's human, and so he contradicts himself all the fucking time, okay? There's all sorts of things that he says, and then the next day he says something else. Because all of us contradict ourselves because we're human beings. But two, this is a really complicated issue where he has specific special definitions for science fiction and fantasy, where they mean the same thing, and then on another day, maybe they don't mean the same thing. It depends on the context. So it's all these different things like this. So,
I love you, man. I love when you get riled up. I promise you.
I do.
It is not my intent to rile you up. It is not my intent. But I love it when you get riled up. I love it.
Because I know what you're talking about, like, and I know the people you're talking about when they're like, "Oh, Preston called him a liar." Like, fuck you! I did not fucking call anybody a liar. Jesus fucking Christ.
You better watch out for Preston. Why? He's a manipulator.
He's a manipulative liar. You're a liar. Fuck you! Like, oh god, like so disingenuous bullshit. Ugh.
And it's funny too, is because like it's not even the person we're talking about. Like it's like other people, and I'm like, oh, I wonder where you got that from.
Yeah, of course, because it's like the same person being like, oh, what a great piece, what a great talking point that you can like spread around. It's like I'm fucking watching Fox News.
Now calm down. You are the Kellyanne Conway of the fandom. Calm down.
Right. Yeah, of course.
I say this as the Alex Jones of the fandom.
As the Alex Jones, right? Yeah.
Like I said, this is actually something I've been curious in as well, because as we've been talking almost daily now for a little over a year, and I don't think we've actually went into like deep discussion over the whole series being sci-fi and fantasy and whatnot and so forth. So I'm glad we had this discussion. Plus, I'm sure a lot of people have also wanted this for a while now too.
Yeah. No, it's and there's actually so much more. I'm sure the subject will come back again because there's so much more to it.
There's more to it? Oh my god.
Well, I mean, this is like a major theme to like, I mean, you know, like at the foundation of the series, like George R. R. Martin was obsessed with this idea, and you know he's been obsessed with it for a long time, and this is something he thinks about a lot. Like these he thinks about these definitions a lot, and then he claims that these definitions don't mean anything. So I don't know. Take what you can from it. But
well, we'll redo a we'll do another one if people want it enough. Guys, go follow Preston on Twitter. Preston will make a poll, and you can vote if you want a part 2 to this. By the way, I just wanted to say Preston's Lemongate t-shirt is still on sale. Preston, people wanted me to ask you, are we ever going to get a Lemongate thong? Is that ever going to go down?
Oh man, Lemongate thong, that's a tougher one. Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's interesting because there's been about I'm not saying Lemongate, like about 100 people have bought Lemongate t-shirts, and it's funny because somebody sent me a was it you that sent me the story, or did I read it myself about how he put one of my followers put on his Lemongate t-shirt, and he was like walking around the street, and some guy was like Chad Summerchild, King of the North. And he's like, what? It was like, it totally made my day to like hear that story. I was like, what?
People always send me pictures of themselves in Lemongate t-shirts, and I always pass them along to you. So, of course,
yes, it's true. Let's
get some Lemongate thongs and booty shorts and fanny packs and flamethrowers, the usual. Comic books.
But no, I'm looking into creating some better designs, some cooler designs in the future.
course.
So,
guys, thank you so much for joining us on this. If you want to, hear some more discussions on this topic, let us know in the comment section below. I'll try to respond to as many as I can. And if you have any more topics for us to discuss on another mini, also leave them down below. We'll see you all next time. Have a good one.